Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I wanted to give you all my first impressions after playing with the newly added and adjusted level 7 Affix on the 10.1 PTR, as well as just Season 2 in general after having tested all of the new dungeons. I've been playing a bunch of the PTR to help prepare for all of my guide videos coming in next patch, and it turns out that patch is coming actually very soon, with Blizzard announcing that the patch is going to release on May 2nd, with the season coming 1 week later on May 9th. So that means there's not really a lot of time left to iterate on the dungeons and affixes, so hopefully we see some significant changes to both in the near future. Now let's get into the affix talk here, and I wanted to first start by highlighting some of the goals of this affix refresh as stated by Blizzard, and then cover the affixes themselves. So in a blue post that came out earlier this week, they mentioned a few key goals of this affix change, such as wanting to highlight different forms of player utility each week, allowing different classes to shine, as well as reducing the cognitive load on players via the removal of seasonals and design of new affixes by slowing down their trigger rate and toning down the required response by players. Now, unfortunately, while I actually agree with both of these goals Blizzard has, I think that their execution in a few of the aspects was a bit rough to say the least. So let's get into that, starting with the reworked explosive. The goal here was to move away from it being a healer affix to a DPS affix, as they drastically increased the health of the orbs themselves while reducing their spawn rate to compensate, with the goal of forcing DPS players to swap to them in order to kill them before the detonation goes off. I actually don't dislike the idea here, however the tuning was certainly off, which is kind of to be expected, right? It's the first week of doing affix testing, but basically what happened was they had way too much HP. I think on a plus 20 initially they had like 700,000 HP per explosive orb. That was brought down a little bit over the weekend, but still very high number, and since they were still considered totems, you couldn't AoE them, so you had to swap to them even in AoE pulls, and this was just basically a massive time loss, so big that the kind of default strategy that arose in a lot of PTR groups was to actually just ignore them entirely and just have your healer heal through them. Basically still a healer affix, just in an entirely different way. Now there are a couple ways to maybe help fix this, the biggest one being making them not totems anymore, and I think that could actually be a big help. So you can actually cleave them with AoE abilities. You'd still likely need to swap to them at some point just to make sure they actually die and get finished off, but the actual time loss would be significantly reduced because, especially in AoE, you'd be able to actually partially cleave them down while also doing damage to the pack still. You don't have to stop your damage to the rest of the pack to kill the explosives. That would help a lot, especially if it's tuned correctly. I think regardless, your health does need to be reduced a little bit here still, but that's just one thing that could help with that. Now, if they don't want to reduce or get rid of rather the totem kind of classification of explosives, I think their health needs to be brought way down, like a very significant nerf. Again, otherwise it's just going to lead to people ignoring them entirely. Another thing, the spawn rate, it was reduced, as they said, but I still think the trigger rate is a bit too high. There were times on trash pulls where we saw at least 3 of these up at a time. Again, 3 times 700k health, a lot. You had single target down. It was just literally impossible to kill them all. Even on some bosses, we saw like 2 explosives up at the same time on a single target boss, which just seemed ridiculous, especially with them being totems. But even on a single target boss encounter, if they weren't totems, it would still be a massive time loss given their current HP, just because it's not really a situation where you're AoEing anyway. So you're already single targeting, and then now you just have to swap and single target something else. So this is really just another situation where that health decrease I was just mentioning is probably really important, maybe even just a further trigger reduction during boss encounters. But I think even then, without some actual reason to kill the orbs, there's a good chance that you would still just ignore them on boss fights and just heal through the damage, unless there's like a very dangerous overlap, for example. And I'm not really sure how to fix that issue without making the affix feel overly punishing. Overall, I do think they have the right idea with explosive, but again, health is a bit too high, and the totem specification makes the affix a bit too punishing to deal with when it comes to time loss. So I think those are actually relatively easy fixes for the affix though, so hopefully we see that soon. Next, let's go over the new affixes, and let's continue the theme of healer affixes here by looking at Afflicted. So some additional information that's been confirmed since the data mining of these affixes. The mobs do have all 3 status effects, so you don't need a specific type. They have poison, disease, and curse, and you just need to remove one of them. So any dispel from a healer or DPS or tank spec besides Mass Dispel from priests, is able to remove these in a single global. And if you don't have any spells left for whatever reason, maybe you have to use them for the pack, they also can be healed up, and their health values actually seemed fairly forgiving at about like 150-ish K when we tested it. This actually, again, pretty easy for healers to actually get through and heal up in case you did have multiple spawn at the same time, which did happen. There were cases where we had 2 or even 3 or even 4 of these spawn at one time, and obviously if you only have 1 dispel available, maybe 2, maybe 3, but unlikely, then you had to heal through these, but it didn't seem too punishing in that sense. This did kind of have the same issue as old explosive or current live explosive, where the 2 main ways to deal with this affix are things healers can always do. So it kind of gets relegated to be a healer affix, whereas many DPS specs either can't help, right? Like rogues can't really do anything to this affix, or they're maybe forced to pick up a talent, which they either may not get, or even if they do get, maybe a significant DPS loss to kind of get. Some of the trees are still built that way, unfortunately. So that likely just means at the highest level, a lot of the responsibility here is going to be pushed onto the healer, and I do think that that's a bit of a problem, right? I will say this is the easiest of the 4 rework / new affixes that I'm talking about today to deal with. If you consider that it's replacing an affix like Grievous, I will say I think Afflicted is easier to handle than Grievous, so it's the lesser of 2 evils maybe, but again, that doesn't change the fact that this is an affix that really only the healer is going to be interacting with in most groups. So again, not really sure how to fix that problem, just my thoughts on it right now. As I mentioned, multiple can spawn at the same time as well, so this scales with pack size, just like Explosive did, which can cause the number of these to be overwhelming on bigger pulls. So I think something that I will be talking about a little bit later as well, that would be good for an affix like this, is putting a cap on the total number that can be up. On top of this, something that's actually been brought to my attention by other players that maybe not even consider is that a lot of healers, they heal off their party frames, right? These mobs, they do not show up there, and so potentially having a little quality of life change where like their health bar can pop up like a boss health frame or something like that, so you can both see how many are up very easy, quickly, and be able to actually target them for healers that aren't used to, they have to go like find, click, whatever. Obviously that's like something that maybe is going to be fixed by an add-on or whatever, but I really do think that Blizzard should try their best to have add-ons not be required to handle affixes. So a nice little quality of life change to make targeting them for healer players a little easier would be good for sure. Then we have the CC affix Incorporeal, and we have a lot of new info on this one actually from the testing. So first, these are also considered totems, just like Explosive, which means any form of AoE CC, so like Ring of Peace, Cap Totem, Typhoon, these do not affect them at all. However, there is the benefit of this totem kind of tag in that AoE damaging abilities don't hit them either. So if they spawn close to a pack, you're not worried about accidentally cleaving them and breaking any CC you put onto them because the AoE effects don't hit them. In addition to this, they also count as all mob families, and so any CC that has restrictions, regardless of what they are, will work on them. So things like Shackle Undead, right, that works. Things like Hibernate, that works. Imprison, you get the idea. Combined with these mobs also being kickable, that means that pretty much every class in the game has multiple ways to actually stop the cast of these mobs, including options that won't take away CC already being used on the pack itself as like important AoE stops in particular, since AoEs don't work, but also like single target stops such as like Kidney or Hodge can still be saved in a lot of cases to be used on trash mobs, and you can use other CCs on this affix mobs. There are a couple of problems that do exist with these. Just like the Afflicted affix, this one will scale with the number of mobs in a pull, so bigger pulls means you're going to have to CC more mobs from this affix, and generally I'm not really a fan of that kind of design. I find it overly punishing to bigger pulls, which already, if you're pulling bigger, that's kind of the increased difficulty. And now that we're seeing 3 of these level 7 affixes act in this way, scaling with mob count, I find it's just going to drastically limit pull creativity and pull size too much. Again, going back to the saying, I much rather want to be playing the dungeon and not the affix, and so having so many of these affixes, not even counting something like bolstering on the level 4 row, only looking at the level 7 row here, having 3 of them limit maybe pull size because they're going to be more spawns that you're going to have to deal with, and potentially you're going to reach a point where your healer doesn't have enough dispel / healing throughput to heal through the number of afflicted mobs. You don't have enough other CCs to use on corporeal mobs because you have to use so many CCs on a bigger pull, that kind of thing. Just having that limit gameplay, I think, is not fun, and I don't want to be playing the Affix specifically. And I think you can solve that by putting a cap on the total number of mobs, where you still have to obviously play the Affix to a degree, but it's not drastically limiting the pulls you can do, because hey, if there's a cap of like 3 of these mobs up at a time, most groups don't need to eat into their stops that you need for a pack in order to maintain this. And again, the brain power, that cognitive load they're talking about, is lesser for this. Whereas like now, like you could pull, I think I saw someone pulled like 6 mobs and they got 4 of these to spawn, right? That seems like a very high cognitive load, right? So I think the trigger rate could go down and even be capped for all of these affixes: Incorporeal, Afflicted, and Explosive. And I think that would also be helpful to not limit pull size and creativity on these weeks, since they're going to be now making up the bulk of all weeks in a season. If they don't want to do that, I think potentially another change you could do to this affix is make it very similar to the bats that spawned from the Shrouded affix, if you guys remember that, or as a more recent example, the mini boss at the end of Court of Stars that summons those bats. Basically, it's just a cast. If you CC it once, you're done. Obviously, for this affix, you have to keep them CC'd or not have them finish their cast, which is 8 seconds long, within their 20-second duration, like uptime. So you have to CC them usually either a couple times if it's short-term CCs, or one time if it's one of the long-term CCs, like the Hibernate or Shackle Undead that I mentioned. But just having it be a one-and-done situation, regardless of the CC used, could also be helpful here. Speaking of that duration, though, these mobs can also be quite annoying, because they will keep you in combat until they disappear, just like Spiteful, and that prevents you from doing things like re-stealthing, like drinking to get your mana back, like rezzing anyone that died, right? So if you get one that spawns right at the end of the pack, you need to do any of those things, you're kind of just out of luck for 20 seconds, right? You got to stand there and wait to do it, or just continue on without doing it, right? So maybe having these despawn at the end of combat, or like I said, just having it be a 1cc and done situation would help to fix that issue. One issue that I'm not really sure how to address is the difficulty of this affix in a pug environment. As most people who pug know, it's extremely hit or miss whether people are going to be using things like kicks or CC effectively without that kind of coordination or communication that happens in a pug group, right? Let alone CCs and stops like we're talking about here, right? So having an entire affix kind of revolving around everyone or people just in general doing that is likely going to make pugging this week an absolute nightmare. And I'm not really sure how to fix that. In the same vein, it's likely that in high-end groups, this affix is again going to be something that's going to be handled by the healer, especially those that have access to spammable CCs. You may have other players kind of helping out here or there, but it just feels like the optimal thing for top groups to do on a lot of these affixes that they've done here on the level 7 row is to just relegate that to the person who has the least DPS benefit per global, which is the healer. And I'm not really sure, again, how to address that problem. Maybe you guys have some ideas, though. Let me know down in the comments below. Finally, that brings us to the last affix here, Entangling. Very similar to the removed Quaking. On a timer, some roots will spawn below every player that snare them. It's not a full root, it's just a snare. And if you don't outrange them or remove the snare before that time is up, you get stunned for 3 seconds. Unlike Quaking, this appears to only ever happen during combat, so it won't happen outside of combat. However, just like Quaking, it can have some extremely punishing overlaps, particularly with certain boss mechanics that hopefully get blacklisted so they can't happen. Think of things like the spear grip on the last boss of Nokud, or stacking in the puddles on Bone Maw, right? If you ever had Quaking during those, you were dead. Completely unfair overlaps. They eventually did get removed, but it took some time, and I just find it odd that Blizzard is bringing back an affix that almost has the exact same issues, because they discussed multiple times how Quaking kind of limited the design space in Mythic Plus, and they didn't like that. But again, Entangling kind of does the same thing. As an example from our testing, the final boss in Vortex Pinnacle, he puts down a little area that you need to run to and stand in, and then pulses raid damage, which is basically lethal if you're outside of the area, but just kind of high inside the protected area. So we had an Entangling spawn inside that protected area, meaning our choice was, for specs that can't break the snare anyways, either run out of the safe zone and break it, likely dying in the process, or just eat the stun in the safe zone while taking constant raid damage. Now, clearly the choice there is to stay in the safe zone and eat the stun, and that didn't wipe us on the plus 15 fortified key we were doing. However, if you move that up to a higher tyrannical key and your healer gets stunned for 3 seconds during heavy raid damage, that's probably going to be a wipe, right? Like that. Think about getting your healer stun for 3 seconds during the Herja lightning phase, right? You're dead for sure, which is exactly what it does in that scenario, and that's kind of the similarities to quaking. However, there are also some situations where quaking wouldn't be an issue, where entangling is. For example, any boss mechanic that requires heavy movement, such as running out of like a large AoE like Odin, or dodging like a giant breath like any of the dragon bosses, or to use one of the new bosses as an example, running away from the pull-in done by Treemouth, one of the bosses in Brackenhide. If entangling comes out right after this pull-in starts, you're snared, you can't really outrun this snare, you're getting pulled in constantly, there's a good chance you get sucked right into Treemouth, and that's obviously not good. It kind of makes the mechanic insanely difficult, if not impossible to do for a fair number of classes, and it's just not fun to deal with. I do think that outside of those kind of specific situations, the Affix is actually not too bad to deal with, but again, there's quite a few of these mechanic overlaps that need to have entangling spawns blacklisted for, just like quaking did. Otherwise, it's just going to be a frustrating, unfun experience on those bosses whenever it's an entangling week, and I'm really hoping that they kind of vet it out before entangling releases, instead of having people kind of find them on live and wait a week to actually get them fixed, because that first entangling week is going to be rough, let me tell you. Another thing is I'd like to see kind of a better visual for entangling. The roots are definitely not hard to see in some cases, especially like range players, right? They're out in their own land, they see the entangling, move out of it. But I think in melee specifically, it can kind of be lost in the clutter of spell effects, ground effects, or even just underneath the mobs themselves, because they can just spawn under the pack if you're facing it, right? So it can be extremely hard to tell if you're entangled without using a weak aura, which again is something that I'm sure Blizzard does not want to be the case, especially after the whole Thundering debacle, right? Just something that makes it exceptionally clear when entangling is happening, regardless of where the entangling spawns, would be nice. And something else that you can incorporate into this is actually a few second grace period for when the snare comes out. Currently, entangling just spawns and you're snared instantly, no warning whatsoever. So just having a few seconds of that kind of grace period before the entangling actually spawns and snares you would just be nice, to give you a chance to think about what your next move is. And again, reduce that cognitive load like they keep saying. Overall, I will say I'm very excited for Season 2, but with a short amount of time before the patch comes out now, and currently there's been no tuning on any of the dungeons or affixes in the limited testing that's happened, I'm a bit worried that we're going to be in a similar situation as we were in Season 1, where it takes like a month or two for the dungeons to actually be in a good spot when it comes to balance. I'm especially a bit worried, as Blizzard also mentioned wanting to reduce things like ability bloat, as well as spammable spellcast due to that interrupt lockout nerf, which hasn't had much kind of talk about it, but happened right at the beginning of the Temple 1 PTR. However, that has yet to be realized, especially in the Dragonflight dungeons, but also in like things like the reworked Vortex Pinnacle. There's mobs sometimes that have 2, 3, or even 4 different abilities, which is just too much, and hopefully it gets pruned down soon. Otherwise, I'd be prepared for a pretty difficult start of the season here if we don't get adjustments in PTR builds coming in the near future. But there we have it, guys. That was my first impressions after testing both the new seasonal dungeons and affixes on the PTR. For anyone interested, I will be putting out similar Mythic Plus and Raid Guide videos just like I did for Season 1, so if that's something you want to see, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. If you want to check out how the 10.1 PTR is shaping up or ask me any questions, feel free to stop by my Twitch at Tactics. I stream most evenings, and once patch drops, I'll be on every single day, so come say hi. Otherwise, I want to give a big thank you to all of my supporters over on Patreon. It really does mean a lot to me, and I'll see you all in the next video.